councillor, but he's also vice chair of the Northamptonshire Equality and Rights Council, and I think he works as an independent diversity and equalities consultant. So he knows pretty much all there is to know about the fields of equality. So I'll hand over to you, Paul, and to tell me.
Can people hear me? I've got this mic's working. Is it working okay? Great. Can I first of all say, before I get into this, the topic of this evening, that it's a real pleasure to be back here, because I came here, must be over 50 years ago, and came to regular events when I was about 16, 17 years of age. I was born in Leicester, went to Bowman Lee's secondary modern and then the Wigston Boys School. And when I was in the sixth form at Wigston Boys School, I was encouraged to kind of open my mind. And so I used, when I was about 17 years of age, I used to come to events here. I also spoke at an event here, organised by the Labour Party Young Socialists. It must have been 1970, because it was the time of the Stop the 70s tour. Do you remember about to stop the rugby team, the South African rugby team playing down by the Leicester Tigers? And the Labour Party Young Socialists organised a meeting about South Africa, the South African apartheid. And I was an activist then in the Labour Party Young Socialists and spoke. It must have been at the room upstairs, because I said, my memory is it was a much bigger room than this, so it must have been the one upstairs. And it had loads of people at it. I mean, it was quite a big thing because of the Stop the 70s tour. So it's great to come back after so long. Perhaps I left it too long. I ought to sort of come back earlier. I'd also like to thank Helen and Mel for arranging this for me to come this evening. It came a bit of a shock to be invited to speak. I don't normally get invited to speak about things like this, and but this is a topic that I've been working on now, for getting on for 20 years. And the presentation I'm going to give is one that's been evolving as things have changed, as case law and things have evolved. And so it's a big presentation, but you're not going to hear all of it, because it's an evolving piece of work which now stretches to 20 or 30, 40 slides. You're only going to get a kind of a snippet at the beginning. So it's nice to see some old friends. Mel, we go back many years when Mel was worked at Nottingham Community Relations Council, isn't it? And I worked at Wellingborough Community Relations Council. So it's nice to see Mel and some old friends here this evening. Okay, equality conflicts. The outline of what I want to say, you don't need to read this. I'm going to talk to it mostly, but just for those of you who want to read this. Equality conflicts is it's regularly in the news. I don't know if you've noticed, over the past 10 years or more, issues of equality, the conflict between different protected characteristics, whether that's gay people, gay rights, religious rights, racial rights of racial minorities, versus other rights, it's constantly been in the news and has been litigated. So you've probably heard some of the more kind of media savvy cases, such as the gay cake case. You heard of that when it was in Northern Ireland, which was an issue of religious rights versus some gay people who commissioned the cake. So it got the famous gay rights case. So, but in the United States as well, there's constant litigation around rights under the American Constitution. But in the UK, these keep occurring. In this short presentation, I'll be exploring some of the human rights principles which I think underpin how we can approach these kinds of conflict, because they're often posed as rights of gay people versus religious people, for example. I want to argue that we can transcend that by looking at human rights principles, that in fact they're not conflicts between different groups of people with protected characteristics, but rather another kinds of conflicts which have existed for a long while historically, but we've resolved them by looking at basic human rights principles that underpin them. So that helps us to understand them better. And what I essentially want to argue, I think, is that these conflicts essentially boil down to historic challenges to a status quo in which power and privilege rests with some groups, but groups which have been traditionally oppressed or had no rights are now challenging for those rights in a current context. So we've got this evolving history whereby people in positions of power or groups that have traditionally been historically had power are having that power challenged. And therefore, these equality conflicts often involve intolerance to these new rights that people are wanting, or prejudice or historic privileges. And also, as an opener, I would like to suggest that these rights of gay people, the rights of black people for equality, the rights of disabled people, the rights of women, these rights which are now enshrined in law, both the Equality Act 2010 in the UK, but also human rights principles, stand together as a package that if we don't treat them as a package, they start to unravel for everyone. And therefore we need to be considering that whenever we look at equality conflicts, because so often what people are trying to claim is their right against somebody else's right, and they're not seeing it as these rights as a package which we all kind of sign up to as a social contract, but rather they're seen as played off against each other. Okay, now, how did I start this journey? And it's quite fortuitous, really. I worked as the equality officer at the University of Northampton. One day I was telephoned by people in our social work division who said, "Paul, can you help us? World War III basically is breaking out between our students, between those students who support gay rights and those students who hold strong religious beliefs, mostly Christian religious beliefs, of what might be described as a more fundamentalist kind. They were anti-gay rights. And these are social work students. And they were saying, "Paul, how can we manage this conflict between these students?" And that's when I had to think for a while, how do I talk to these students about this issue? Because it was getting where there were almost punch-ups between these students, where the Christian students were saying that, for example, that gay couples shouldn't adopt children in a social work context. It was for social work students. And the other students were saying, no, gay rights are really important. Why shouldn't gay men or lesbians adopt children? So it was getting very fraught. So that's where I started from. It was posed to me as an equality conflict. And I had to start to think through, how can I approach this with these students? And just to give you an example of the kind of thing, I'm sure you're familiar with some of these things. This is an organisation who regularly litigates, takes cases involving Christians, and I use that term in inverted commas because they are not representative very much of Christians generally. They tend to be, as I say, a more fundamentalist kind of Christian who doesn't believe in gay rights. But this is how it's often posed. And I know many Christians who stand up rigorously for gay rights, and indeed other people who are non-religious, of course. But this is the way the Christian Legal Centre poses the question. We deal with a wide range of issues, including those who have been asked not to wear a cross, those who have lost their job, offering to pray or witness to colleagues, for refusing to act against their conscience. So they pose it as a conflict between their rights as Christians. And again, they attack the Equality Act 2010. The practice of homosexuality has been given very significant legal protections. Unfortunately, this has resulted in a remarkable assault on freedom of religion in the public sphere. So this is their argument of this particular group of Christians. So how do we address it? Well, first of all, I wanted to look back in history. And again, you'll be familiar with some of these rights here. Rights of black people versus the rights of white people. You even hear this today. You'll hear white supremacists argue that their rights as white people are being taken away from them by black people because of the Black Lives Matter movement. But historically, arguments against slavery were often posed in this kind of conflict. How did we resolve that? We argued it by talking about human rights, back to basic humanity, for all people have to be treated equally and fairly. That it wasn't a question of rights for white people versus the rights of black people. It was the rights of white people, of racists, essentially arguing against the rights of everybody, not black people. So if there was a conflict at all, it was about our basic humanity against those that want to deny rights to others. Likewise, as a trade unionist, now you'd be familiar historically in the labour movement, trade unions, the rights of children who shouldn't be working versus the rights of factory owners. How did we resolve that? How did we stop children working at the age of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in factories? We argued that children's rights must trump the rights of factory owners to exploit children who lack power, lack influence and need to be protected by society. And therefore the rights of factory owners historically were overcome by an appeal to the rights of children, to basic humanity as children that need protecting, not exploiting. And then finally, I've got the example here, the rights of women, stroke wives, versus the rights of men. And again, sometimes you'll hear these arguments today. Lawrence Fox, some of you will be familiar with Lawrence Fox, the actor, will come out with this sort of rubbish from time to time in terms of, these campaigns for women's rights have undermined the rights of men. That somehow, as men now, are the exploited group by women. Clearly nonsense, frankly, but these arguments go back to these arguments in the 19th century and earlier around property rights, the rights of inheritance, where it was argued that men should continue to be dominant and have privilege over women. So it was a battle about privilege and human rights again, human rights for all men and women to be treated fairly and equitably. And I put here to note that there are, of course, huge numbers of justifications, biblical justifications, and indeed within other faiths, for racism and slavery historically. So these so-called equality conflicts are not new. But I would argue, coming back to my core argument, these are not equality conflicts. They're essentially about how do we approach historical privilege and the fight for equality and justice for all. And I want to suggest that there's some basic underlying human rights principles which underpin how we should approach these conflicts. And the first one, I've already mentioned this, is you can't pick and choose which rights you want and which rights you don't want. They come as a package, and we must accept that, and the compromises that may come with it, if we're going to live in a society in which there's relative, I'm not going to say harmony, because there's always going to be some degree of conflict in society, but we get on together and we have to compromise. And I always think about the time when I was in India. I was in Pune, And I was living amongst a multi-faith society there. There was a Jewish synagogue down the road, there was a Jain temple, Hindu temple, Christian churches, Muslim mosques. And while there is conflict often in India between different faiths, in Pune where I was living and had friends, essentially people got on. Because that's what human beings generally do. We muddle through and accept compromises, and indeed also the benefits of a society which is complex and diverse. So for example, everyone celebrated Diwali. Muslims, Hindus, Christians, Jains, all participated in Diwali as a festival. India closes down at Christmas. India's got a secular constitution, so in terms of the state and the way the state, generally speaking in India, it's increasingly being challenged by the current government in India, but essentially India has a secular constitution, but it allows for the flowering of tolerance and respect between all the different faiths and traditions. And if people want to live together without communal conflict, they have to get on. So you take it as a package in order to live. And that's an underlying human rights principle. I don't think I need, oops, let's just go back. Yeah, I think I've covered social content. Oh yeah, and this is related to the social work students. I have to say to these students, and you wouldn't think you'd have to say this to social work students, but in order to be a social worker, you have to be non-judgmental. You can't provide services as a social worker to everybody in society if you're going to start to make judgments about the people you're going to serve. So if you're a fundamentalist Christian and you're not prepared to serve gay people or to work with gay colleagues or to provide services to gay people within a social work context, I said, you can't be a social worker. So I was saying to those students who were anti-gay, you've got to make a decision here, because as a society, we live in a diverse society, and if you make judgments about people and providing those services to them, you can't provide them in a fair and equitable manner to all. And so it's a package. You have to take your service users as a package. I said, and as a social worker, you will come across some pretty strange people, well, not strange, but difficult people as a social worker. You're going to come across people who smell. You're going to come across people who are really poor. You're going to come across people with mental health difficulties. And if you start to be morally judgmental about them in terms of their lifestyle or who they are, you will not be able to do your job. So non-judgmental is at the core of providing these services on an equitable basis. That didn't go down very well with some of the students I was speaking to. But I think I was right. And it made some of them think. Because the case law, the law, backs that up. And I might come on to this later if we've got time, but there's certainly case law, very clear case law, where people who refused to provide services to gay people and argued that it was their religion, prevented them from this because their religion said that gay people were sinful. The law is very clear, right up to the European Court of Human Rights. If you provide services to the public, you cannot pick and choose who you provide those services to. And all the cases brought by fundamentalist Christians, by the Christian Legal Centre, have been lost. So it's the law is very clear. So what I was saying to these students is that not only am I saying in a kind of a moral sense, appealing to their judgment and as training social workers, but I was saying you will also get the sack. Because if you behave in ways which discriminate against other people in providing services, you will get the sack, and you will deserve to get the sack, because that's not how professional social workers behave in doing their job. Now, are you familiar with the protected characteristics? So this is enshrined in the Equality Act 2010. Race, sex, gender, gender reassignment, sexual orientation, age, disability, pregnancy, maternity, religion, beliefs, marriage, civil partnership. So these things come as a package of rights in the Equality Act. And also the Human Rights Act incorporates these as well, plus others. I mean, the Human Rights Act is in some ways broader than the Equality Act. But I won't go into that kind of detail here.
I just say, there's no class on that.
No.
Class is not on there.
No. Social class is not.
Class.
Social class was in the Equalities Act, but the Tories have refused to implement that section of the Equality Act. So it wasn't actually the same as these other protected
So you can't
characteristics.
discriminate against someone's class. It's quite legal, there's no problem with that.
Well, it's complicated, and we perhaps could talk afterwards, but there are ways in which you can incorporate class if it disproportionately adversely affects people who are a protected characteristic.
It's not on there.
But no, the notion of class is not in there. But if, for example, black people are disproportionately working class, and there's a policy which disproportionately affects black people, then black people can take a
So you
claim.
can't be white and working class then.
Sorry?
You can't be white and working class then.
Yeah.
You're just saying you've got to be black.
No, I was just using that as an example.
What about the example of white and working class? It's not on there.
No, it's not mine. Don't blame me. I would put social class in there, and it was in the original Equality Act and still is, but it's not been implemented.
You can see how that's
in
causing
the
a
way that
problem
it
there.
should.
That's really causing a problem in the system, isn't it?
Yeah. The social class is a big determining feature, but there are ways in which you can fight class discrimination through other protected characteristics. So, for example, working class women have fought successfully for rights as working class women, say in pension schemes, to have equality in pension scheme provision, for example, benefited by fighting it under the indirect discrimination clauses of the Equality Act or Sex Discrimination Act, that benefited working class women.
So if you're a white working class man,
Yeah,
you're right at the bottom.
it's also
You're right at the bottom.
no, it's also benefited working class men as well, ironically, because it's indirect discrimination benefited everybody, but disproportionately it benefited working class women because, for example, working class women were disproportionately working part-time. Men weren't working part-time. Men had full-time jobs. So men were entitled to pension schemes, whereas working class women who worked part-time historically were not able to get pension schemes. So the case was taken, it was found to be discrimination on working class women benefited from that change, that recognition. So you won't find any occupation now where men get pensions but women don't, or part-time women don't. You get me? We can talk afterwards, because it is quite a complex issue. The second human rights principle that I want to suggest is that the rights and freedoms of others, we must respect or uphold the rights and freedoms of others. And that there's no right to harm others. So now this is where it becomes a little bit more complicated. But if you take it back to that basic principle that my rights cannot be upheld if I'm taking the rights away from you. You know, that is not a principle under human rights which we can accept. My rights and your rights both need to be understood and respected. And this again applies to the case of the social workers. Come back to the case of the social workers. That the rights of religious people, whoever they may be, cannot trump the rights of other people, cannot take away the rights of other people, and vice versa. And there's been quite a lot of cases involving, for example, hotels where Christians ran a hotel and a gay couple went to stay at the hotel and they refused permission, and the hotel owners argue that because they're Christians that they don't believe in homosexuality, therefore they don't want gay people staying in their hotel. Again, the courts have said that is unlawful. You can't say that. The same applies the other way round. If a gay couple were running a hotel, a Christian couple wanted to go to the hotel, the gay couple could not say, we're not letting you into have a room in our hotel because you are gay, because you are Christian. And so these rights belong to both of us, all of us, and you cannot enforce one right against another right by taking away another right. And you certainly can't harm other people in terms of human rights legislation. Now, harm has been interpreted quite narrowly in a human rights context. So, for example, far-right fascist groups have argued, in some cases, that in banning them or preventing them from doing things is against their human rights as a fascist group. And the courts have certainly in Europe, where there's been more cases of human rights legislation in Europe on this, have said that as a fascist group, you are campaigning to remove the rights and freedoms of others. Therefore, your organisation cannot legitimately claim rights under the Human Rights Convention because you are wishing to take away the rights and freedoms of others. So your rights are effectively removed because you want to remove the rights and freedoms of others. And I think that's pretty legitimate, but it's been narrowly, that harm in that context has been interpreted very narrowly, both in Europe and in the British courts. So it has to be so serious harm. So these fascists want to eliminate groups of people, or to engage in gross human rights abuses against gay people or what have you. But
just saying that most of those right-wing people you're talking about are white, working-class males, aren't they? And they're not on that list.
no,
And that's the reason it's causing problems.
no.
They are to blame.
They're not.
They are to blame for all the discrimination in society. That's what that list is saying.
No, they're being denied their
and
rights
that's why
because they
that's
want
why
to
they're
remove.
drifting to the right. They're drifting
Irrespective
to the
of
right
who they are.
because they're not on that list.
Irrespective of who they
They
are.
are the trouble causes on that list. And that has to change.
Irrespective of who they are, whether they're white, working class, or what have you,
They're fighting for
their rights are being removed because they want to take away the rights and freedoms from other people.
No, they're fighting for their
I
equality.
think we need to deal with the Christians, I agree.
They're fighting for their equality. That's what they say.
No. But if you look
That's
at
why
it,
they're drifting from the left to the right.
but their rights are not legitimate if they're taking away the rights and freedoms of others.
Oh, they're to blame then.
Let him
Yes.
finish.
Absolutely.
Right, they're to blame then.
Right.
They're to blame for all the discrimination. They're to blame for that.
Questions at the end.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Can we deal with this at the end, Greg,
It
please?
doesn't matter who they are. Individuals and groups cannot claim protection for activity that advocates for or removes or destroys the rights and freedoms of others. It's got nothing to do with who the individuals and groups are, but if they're advocating for the removal of the rights and freedoms of others, then their right to complain of being discriminated against or what have you is not accepted, it's not legitimate. You cannot use your rights to remove the rights of others. So that's a basic human rights principle. And this is reflected here in the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 17. Nothing in this convention may be interpreted as implying for any state, group or person any right to engage in any activity or perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms set forth in the convention. It includes the right not to be discriminated against. So if you advocate for the removal of somebody's rights, you cannot claim the protection under the Human Rights Act. Very simple, but it's a basic principle which exists in human rights protection and helps to explain, or at least understand, why some people's that some equality conflicts are in effect illegitimate. They're not really conflicts. They are conflicts, but they're conflicts between what people are advocating and human rights principles. Nothing to do with the groups that they may or may not be members of. Right, the third one, human rights principle, is that governments and states, including local government, including police, including a whole range of public bodies, must protect the rights and freedoms of others. Must. Not an option. Doesn't mean they always do it. as we know, there are huge weaknesses sometimes in the way government behaves and acts. But human rights principles say that you have to protect the rights of others, particularly if those other people are minority groups who are under threat from having their rights and freedoms removed. Also, at the bottom, here's some small thing. Governments can also take action, and this has been recognised in case law. Governments can also take action to positively promote equality as a matter of public policy, reflecting the democratic will of our society. So, back to the social workers again. Local governments who employ social workers have a duty to protect the rights and freedoms of others, and also can, and in most do, they promote equality as an aim. And therefore, if somebody in their employment says, I don't agree with that particular equality area, don't agree with gay people, don't agree with whatever, then local government can take action against them as their employees. And indeed, many of the cases that have been to court have involved people who have been dismissed or have left their employment as a result of action taken by their employer because of actions that they took which amounted to discrimination against other people. And this is the fourth principle, human rights principle, which can help us to understand, again, some of these conflicts. Government can restrict certain rights if they act in the interest of the greater good, and there are sound reasons to do so. Now, this is a bit more complicated now, getting a bit more complicated in respect of, if you take, for example, secular rights versus religious rights. So the most complicated area is in France. A lot of people are familiar with French secularism, which came out of the French Revolution. I think it's called laicité. I'm not familiar with French. The French notion that French society is secular and doesn't recognise religious rights. So the French government have argued that they have a right to restrict, for example, certain religious rights in the interests of their overriding principle of laicité or secularism. Living in Britain, I must say I struggle with this French notion of secularism because I'm a secularist, I'm a humanist, but I've lived in a society all my life which by and large respects religious freedoms within limits. As long as it doesn't impinge on my rights to be member as a secular person, I'm happy for people to hold their rights as religious people. In France, their notion is slightly different, and they've taken quite an aggressive stance against, for example, the wearing of the burqa in public spaces, not just as employees of the state, but they ban children wearing the hijab in schools. We don't do that in Britain. You know, in Leicester, can you imagine in Leicester if you started to ban the hijab, children wearing the hijab in schools, or Sikhs wearing the turban? World War III would break out. And the French societies, by and large, attempted, I think unsuccessfully by and large, to impose secularism through the banning of a variety of things. Although I read only this week that Mechelon, who's the Prime Minister.
Macron.
Macron held the Hanukkah event in the Elysee Palace. And people have gone absolutely ballistic because they've said this reaches the French notion of secularism and what have you. I found that quite bizarre, really, coming from a British context. Can you imagine the mayor of Leicester not holding a Diwali event in the mayor's chamber, or not holding an Eid event or a Hanukkah event or what have you? Now, these are part of British society, but they're clearly not part of French society, or at least that's what the row's been about. How far should French society impose secularism, or not impose it, but be secular and exclude religion from any of its state functions? And that's something perhaps for discussion later. I'm not that kind of secularist. I hate to say. And finally, I think this is the final one. Historically, equality conflicts have been over changing notions. I mentioned right at the beginning, historical changes over time about what is right and wrong in essence, and what is a human right, and what is now socially acceptable and unacceptable in the way that we mix with one another in this diverse society that we live in. And it's also about historic privilege disappearing in a context in which we have this emerging equality. So historically, men still do have huge amounts of privilege when you look at the way society functions in the context of women. Equal pay, access to services that women may need. So historically, that equality conflict has been between historic privilege that men have had, and indeed I would argue that white people have had over black people, and the fight for equality and human justice is what forms that equality conflict. But I don't accept it as if there's a clash between men and women, or a clash between white people and black people. I say it's a clash between those that want to hang on to those privileges against notions of fairness, justice and equality, which we all benefit from. I think. I'll skip the summary. How long have I got? So I'm just going to summarise them briefly. So the right not to be discriminated against based on a protected characteristic comes as a package. So I think that's fairly clear. The rights and freedoms of others must be upheld and respected. There is no right or freedom to harm others. There is no protection for activity that advocates for the removal or the disruptions of the rights and freedoms of others. Governments, and that's why there's just simply the government, it's government services, police, hospitals, schools, must protect the rights and freedoms of others, especially minorities, and can promote equality as an objective of a public policy. And in certain circumstances, governments can restrict the rights and freedoms of others if they act lawfully. The government has to act lawfully in the interest of the greater good. And that may be, for example, really the biggest example of that recently is the way the government intervened during COVID to restrict our rights and freedoms. And that was a serious breach of our rights and freedoms in our society. But it was argued, and I think not unreasonably, that in a pandemic like COVID, that is a legitimate reason for governments to intervene to restrict those rights and freedoms, but only in the specific circumstances of something like a pandemic or some serious public health or public order situation. So governments can intervene to breach rights and freedoms of others, but only in very, very specific set of circumstances. And I said here, sound evidence-based reasons for doing so. And there's a question, I suppose, more than a statement, although I've made it a statement in my presentation. Is a historic privilege being removed or challenged? Is a group with historic privilege merely trying to protect or defend that privilege? So it's not an equality conflict, it's about protecting privilege. And I would argue that's certainly the case in many of the examples where you hear about equality conflict. I'm going to finish with it. These are some additional complex areas involving equality conflict. I don't claim, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, by the way, so I don't claim to have all the answers here, but some of the more recent equality conflicts which have come on about involve, for example, the argument around women's rights versus trans women's rights. And I'm sure that's been in the news this week in the context of the Scottish Parliament, which legislated to give more rights to trans people in terms of defining their identity and their rights as trans people versus the notion of women's rights. You may want to discuss that. It's a complex area, but I would argue apply the human rights principles we've just discussed here, and it may give us some insight into how that equality conflict might be addressed. Secularism versus religion, I've talked about this in the context of France. It's an ongoing issue, and how far you take that as an equality conflict and how do you resolve it is going to be with us, I suspect, for as long as secularism and religious views exist. But as a society, we need to find ways of managing that, which I think is human rights principles provide us with a mechanism to look at that in perhaps a slightly different way. And then there's some equality conflicts which don't necessarily involve protected characteristics. And that's, for example, the notion of collective rights, e.g. trade union rights versus individual rights. And the rights to protest and strike versus the rights of the public. So the government legislating recently in the context of restricting rights to protest, particularly for people like Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, and more recently they were trying to restrict the rights of those campaigning for Palestinian rights, on the argument of in terms of rights of the public, not to be disturbed, not to have their passage on the roads disrupted. But again, I would argue that you can use those human rights principles to look at some of these things, perhaps in a slightly different way. And I would certainly argue that the last one, my view is that the government is attempting to protect historic privileges in the context of the oil industry and the threat to global warming and the interests which seem to be continually wanting to move down the road of more global warming and the threat to humanity, abusing that by attempting to restrict rights to protest. But you can see the wider issue versus rights to protest and strike, in my view, should be protected. The government is attempting to legislate to protect historic privileges for those that have existed, making lots of money out of global warming, basically. And that's it.